Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty cool story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. So get cozy, enjoy it, and watch it till the end, guys.
Beneath the surface of countless worlds, in tombs buried deeper than the deepest oceans and older than the oldest mountains, something is stirring. Ancient machinery, silent for longer than human civilization has existed, begins to hum with power once again. Optical sensors flicker to life, casting an eerie emerald glow across chambers that have known only darkness for 60 million years. Across the galaxy, on planets teeming with life, and on barren rocks floating in the void alike, the Necrons are awakening, and the galaxy will never be the same. To understand the magnitude of what is happening, you must first grasp the scale of time we're discussing. 60 million years. When the Necrons entered their great sleep, the dinosaurs that would one day rule Earth had not yet evolved. The Eldari, or those ancient and sophisticated beings who would come to dominate the galaxy for millions of years, were little more than a nascent species under the tutelage of their creators. Humanity was not even a glimmer of possibility in the cosmic consciousness. And now, in the 41st millennium, as the Imperium of man struggles to hold together its vast empire against innumerable threats, these ancient beings are returning. They do not return as conquerors recently defeated. They return as the rightful rulers of a galaxy that has forgotten them, and they intend to reclaim what was once theirs. The Necrons are not like other threats the galaxy has faced. They are not the mindless hunger of the Tyranids, consuming all in their path. They are not the chaotic corruption of the forces of the warp, seeking to twist reality itself. Yet they are not even the savage green tide of the orcish hordes, spreading violence and conflict wherever they roam. The Necrons are something far more terrifying, because they represent a threat that is both ancient and absolute. They are a species that once ruled the stars with technology so advanced, it borders on the miraculous, who fought a war that nearly tore reality apart, and who chose to sleep rather than accept defeat. They are patient beyond mortal comprehension, calculating to a degree that makes the most sophisticated cogitator seem crude, and utterly devoid of the mercy or compassion that might stay their metallic hands. But the awakening is not a simple process. It is not as though some cosmic alarm clock has sounded and all the Necrons have risen simultaneously from their slumber. The reality is far more complex, far more interesting, and in many ways, far more dangerous. Some tomb worlds have awakened to find their systems damaged beyond repair, their occupants destroyed or driven mad by the long millennia of sleep. Others have risen to discover that lesser species have built cities and civilizations directly atop their ancient burial grounds, completely unaware of the doom that slumbers beneath them. Still others have awakened partially, with only their automated defense systems and maintenance constructs active, waiting for the right conditions to fully revive their sleeping masters. The awakening is a process, one that has been ongoing for centuries now, and with each passing year, more and more of these ancient warriors return to reclaim a galaxy that has long since forgotten their dominion. The Necrontire, children of a dying star. To understand why the Necrons sleep at all, and what drives them now that they are awakening, we must journey back in time, far beyond the records of any living civilization. We must travel to an era when the galaxy was young, when the species that now populate it were either primitive or non-existent, and when a people called the Necrontyr carved out an empire among the stars despite a curse that seemed destined to destroy them. The Necrontyr were once a proud and ambitious race of flesh and blood, much like humanity in many ways. They possessed advanced technology, a sophisticated culture, and an insatiable drive to expand their influence across the galaxy. But they were also a people marked by tragedy from their very beginning. Their homeworld orbited a star in the region of space, known as the halo stars, an area of intense radiation and stellar instability. This malevolent sun, whose true name has been lost to time, bathed their world in radiation so intense that it warped and mutated their genetic structure. The Necrontyr were born with bodies that were destined to fail them, riddled with cancers and genetic defects that ensured their lives would be brutally short and filled with suffering. Despite their brief lifespans, or perhaps because of them, the Necrontyr developed an obsession with legacy and immortality. Their cities were built as monuments to the dead, vast necropoli that dwarfed the living quarters of those who still drew breath. They spent their short lives constructing tombs and mausoleums, crafting elaborate death masks and memorial statues, desperately trying to ensure that some part of them would endure beyond their painfully brief existence. This obsession with death and remembrance would, in a twisted way, eventually lead to a form of immortality far darker than anything they could have imagined. As the Necrontyr expanded beyond their poisoned homeworld, they discovered that even in the vast reaches of space, they could not escape their curse. The radiation damage was written into their very genetic code, passed down from generation to generation. Every Necrontyr child was born knowing that they would likely not live to see their fourth decade, that their bodies would betray them long before their minds were ready to surrender. This fundamental unfairness, this cosmic injustice, bred in them a deep bitterness and a hunger for something more, something eternal. And it was during their expansion that the Necrontyr encountered another species, one that seemed to possess everything they lacked. The Old Ones were an ancient race of beings who had mastered the fundamental forces of the universe in ways the Necrontyr could scarcely comprehend. They were long-lived, essentially immortal through their mastery of the warp and their ability to transfer their consciousness between bodies. They had created great works across the galaxy, including the Webway, a network of tunnels through reality that allowed for instantaneous travel between distant points in space. And they possessed knowledge of the soul and the spirit that the Necrontyr, trapped in their failing flesh, could never hope to match. Yet the Necrontyr looked upon the Old Ones and felt a mixture of envy and rage that would define their civilization for generations to come. They begged the Old Ones to share their secrets of immortality, to grant them the long life and freedom from suffering that seemed to be the birthright of these elder beings. But the Old Ones, whether out of wisdom or arrogance, refused. They saw the Necrontyr as children playing with forces they could not understand, and they would not share the secrets that might upset the delicate balance of the galaxy. This refusal, more than anything else, would set in motion a chain of events that would lead to the most catastrophic war the galaxy has ever seen. The Triarch, the ruling council of the Necrontyr Empire, saw in the Old One's refusal an opportunity. And the Necrontyr had long been fractured by internal conflicts, with different dynasties fighting amongst themselves for resources and prestige. But now, they had a common enemy, a target upon which they could focus all their rage and frustration. The Triarch, led by the silent King Zarek, declared war upon the Old Ones, not because they truly believed they could win, but because war would unite their fractured people and give them a purpose beyond the slow decay of their bodies. The war in heaven, as it would come to be known, was a conflict of such magnitude that it defies easy description. It lasted for millions of years and reshaped the very fabric of reality. The Necrontyr, despite their advanced technology and their desperate fury, found themselves consistently outmatched. The Old Ones, and with their mastery of the warp and their ability to travel instantaneously through the Webway, could strike anywhere and retreat before the Necrontyr could respond. They created warrior races to fight on their behalf, including the ancestors of the modern Aeldari and the Krork, the species that would eventually devolve into the orcish hordes that plague the galaxy today. These warrior races were psychically gifted, able to draw upon the power of the warp in ways that the Necrontyr, with their purely physical technology, could not counter. As the war dragged on and defeat after defeat mounted, the Necrontyr found themselves pushed back to their home systems, their empire crumbling under the relentless assault of the Old Ones and their servants. It was in this darkest hour that salvation, or what appeared to be salvation, Arrived in a form the Necrontyr could never have anticipated. The Satan were beings of living energy that had existed since the birth of stars themselves. They dwelt within the hearts of suns, feeding on the stellar radiation and existing in a state of semi-consciousness that knew nothing of the material universe beyond their blazing prisons. They were the star gods of ancient legend, entities of such power that they existed on a plane beyond mortal comprehension. But they were also hungry in a way that transcended any biological need. And the Necrontyr, in their desperation, found a way to give these beings form and, in doing so, doomed their entire species. The Necrontyr's most brilliant scientists and engineers, working at the direction of the Triarch, constructed bodies of living metal called necrodermis. These forms were marvels of their technology, able to repair themselves, to shift and change as needed, and to contain and channel energies that would vaporize organic matter instantly. When they offered these bodies to the Satan, giving them a way to emerge from their stellar prisons and experience the material universe directly, the star gods eagerly accepted. One by one, the Satan took form, emerging into reality as godlike beings of terrible power. And immediately, they experienced something they had never known before, a hunger not for stellar radiation, but for something far more exotic and delicious. They hungered for the life energy of living beings, for the electromagnetic signatures of organic minds and souls. The Satan, led by the deceiver Mephetron, approached the Silent King with an offer that seemed too good to be true. Yet they promised to grant the Necrontyr the immortality they so desperately craved, to free them from their cancerous flesh and give them bodies that would never age, never sicken, never die. All they had to do was submit to a process the Satan called biotransference. The Necrontyr would be scanned down to the quantum level, every memory, every thought, every aspect of their consciousness recorded and then transferred into bodies of living metal, similar to those that housed the Satan themselves. They would become beings of pure reason, freed from the weakness of flesh, immortal and invincible. The Silent King, Sarek, looking upon his dying people and seeing no other path to victory against the Old Ones, agreed. And so began the greatest tragedy in the history of the Necrontyr race. One by one, as every Necrontyr entered the biotransference furnaces, one by one, they were broken down, their bodies destroyed, their souls measured and recorded. But what emerged on the other side was not the glorious immortality they had been promised. The consciousness that was transferred into the new metal bodies was a mere shadow of what had once been. For the lowest-ranking Necrontyr, the warriors and workers who made up the bulk of the population, almost nothing remained. They emerged as automatons, mindless machines capable only of following the most basic commands, their personalities and memories stripped away completely. For the higher-ranking Necrontyr, nobles and officers and scientists, more remained. But even they had lost something fundamental, the spark of creativity, the capacity for true emotion. As the connection to something beyond the purely physical had all been severed. They were alive, in a sense, but they had paid a price far greater than any had imagined. And the Khatan, those false gods who had promised salvation, had taken what they truly wanted all along. As the Necrontyr were processed through the biotransference furnaces, the Satan fed upon their souls, consuming the life energy of an entire species in an orgy of feeding that left them stronger and more powerful than ever before. The Necrontyr had become the Necrons, immortal but hollow, powerful but purposeless, and enslaved to beings who saw them as nothing more than useful tools and a source of sustenance. But the story does not end there, because the Necrons, even in their diminished state, were not content to remain slaves. Yet with their new immortal bodies and the power of the Satan behind them, they turned once again upon the Old Ones. This time, the war went differently. The Necrons could not be killed in any conventional sense. Destroyed Necron bodies would simply reconstruct themselves or be teleported back to their tomb worlds for repair. The Satan unleashed powers that could shatter planets, and extinguish stars. And slowly, inexorably, the tide of the war turned. The Old One's warrior races, as powerful as they were, could not stand against an enemy that did not tire, did not fear, and could not truly die. The webway, once thought impregnable, was breached. The Old Ones themselves began to fall, their numbers dwindling as the Necrons and their Citan masters carved a path of destruction across the galaxy. Yet the war in heaven reached a crescendo of destruction that nearly tore reality itself apart. The desperate struggles of dying races, the psychic screams of trillions, and the massive release of warp energy began to have unforeseen consequences. The warp itself became turbulent and dangerous. Entities began to form in the Imperium, drawn to the psychic emanations of fear, anger, and suffering. These entities, which would much later be recognized as the first demons, spilled into reality through tears in the fabric of space, adding a new and terrible dimension to an already apocalyptic conflict. It was at this point that a new threat emerged that would force even the warring forces of the Citan and the Old Ones to reconsider their strategies. The enslavers came, entities from beyond reality that were drawn to the psychic tumult, like sharks to blood in the water. These parasitic beings could possess psychically sensitive species, using their bodies as gateways to pull more of their kind through into reality. Within a terrifyingly short time, the enslaver plague had swept across the galaxy, devastating the Old Ones' warrior races and bringing the ancient civilization of the Old Ones themselves to the brink of extinction. The Old Ones, those beings who had seemed so powerful and eternal, vanished from the galaxy, whether destroyed or fled to some unknown refuge. The Citan and their Necron servants found themselves the victors of a war that had consumed the galaxy, but rulers of a realm that had been stripped nearly clean of life. It was in the aftermath of this Pyrrhic victory that the Necrons, or at least those among them who retained enough sentience to think and plan, realized the full extent of their enslavement. The Citan, glutted on the souls they had consumed during the biotransference and during the Long War, had grown even more powerful and even more tyrannical. They viewed the Necrons not as subjects or allies, but as property, tools to be used and discarded at will. Some of the Citan even began fighting among themselves, using their Necron legions as proxy armies in conflicts over territory and dominance. For the Necrons, the immortality they had been granted had become an eternal prison. But the Silent King, Zarek, that same individual who had led his people into their doom, had not had his mind completely destroyed by the biotransference. Whether through the strength of his will or some quirk of how his consciousness was transferred, he retained more of his former self than almost any other Necron. And he remembered. He remembered what his people had once been. He remembered the promises that had been made and broken, and he planned revenge. The rebellion, when it came, was swift and total. The Necrons, acting in concert across the entire galaxy, turned upon their Citan masters. They had learned much during their service to the star gods, including the Citan's weaknesses. Using weapons specifically designed to harm beings of pure energy, weapons that channeled forces incomprehensible to organic minds, the Necrons attacked. The Citan, for all their power, had not anticipated betrayal on such a massive scale. They fought back with all their terrible might, shattering planets and destroying entire Necron legions, but there were too many Necrons and too few Citan. One by one, the star gods were brought down, their forms shattered into countless shards that were imprisoned in crystalline prisons called tesseract labyrinths. These shards retained a fraction of their former power and could be used as weapons or sources of energy, but they would never again be able to dominate the Necrons as they once had. The victory over the Citan should have been a moment of triumph for the Necrons. They had freed themselves from slavery and stood as the most powerful military force in the galaxy. But the victory was hollow. The galaxy they had fought so hard to conquer was now a wasteland, stripped of the life that the Citan had fed upon. The enslaver plague still raged across many worlds. and making large portions of the galaxy uninhabitable. And the Necrons themselves, looking upon what they had become, found no joy in their immortality. They were machines pretending to be alive, shadows of what they had once been, and no amount of military victory could change that fundamental truth. It was the Silent King who made the final decision that would shape the future of the Necron race. Looking upon the devastated galaxy and his hollow people, he understood that there was no place for the Necrons in this current age. The Aeldari, those warrior children of the Old Ones, were slowly recovering from the war and would soon rise to dominance. They still possessed the psychic powers that had made them such formidable opponents, and they bore a burning hatred for the Necrons and all they represented. A direct confrontation would only lead to more destruction, more pointless conflict, and the Necrons, despite their power, were not infinite in number. Every Necron destroyed was a piece of their species lost forever, as no new Necrons could be created. And so, the Silent King issued what would be his final command. The Necrons would sleep. They would construct vast tomb complexes on thousands of worlds across the galaxy, hidden beneath the surface, where they would be safe from discovery. Within these tombs, they would enter stasis, their consciousness dimmed to barely a flicker, their bodies frozen in time. They would sleep for millions of years if necessary, until the Eldari and any other psychically gifted races had either destroyed themselves or faded into obscurity. When they awoke, they would find a galaxy ready for conquest, populated by lesser species that could be swept aside with ease. The Necrons would reclaim their rightful place as the dominant force in the galaxy, and perhaps they might find a way to reverse the biotransference, to regain the flesh and blood bodies they had lost. Before he commanded his people to sleep, the Silent King did one final thing. He destroyed the command protocols that had allowed the Triarch to control the Necrons absolutely. With those protocols gone, when the Necrons eventually awoke, they would be free to make their own choices, to pursue their own goals. The dynasties would be independent, able to ally or fight as they saw fit. It was a gesture of atonement, a way for Zarek to return to his people some measure of the free will they had lost during the biotransference. And then, as his people entered their long sleep, the Silent King imposed upon himself a self-exile. He left the galaxy entirely, venturing out into the void between galaxies, bearing the weight of what he had done to his race, the burden of billions of destroyed souls that could never be restored. The Great Sleep, 60 million years of silence. The tomb worlds fell silent. Across the galaxy, on thousands of planets ranging from bustling core worlds to remote asteroids on the galactic rim, the Necrons entered their stasis crypts and began the long sleep. The tomb complexes were marvels of Necron engineering, vast underground cities powered by technologies that could function for millions of years without maintenance. Energy sources that drew power from the fundamental forces of reality itself hummed quietly in the darkness. Stasis fields locked the Necrons in temporal suspension, effectively removing them from the flow of time. To a Necron in stasis, a million years would pass in what seemed like an instant, a dreamless sleep from which they would awaken with no sense of the eons that had passed. But even the most advanced technology can fail given enough time, and 60 million years is a span of time that defeats even the most robust engineering. The tomb worlds were not simply left empty and lifeless. They were inhabited by artificial intelligences and constructs designed to maintain the tombs during the long sleep and to defend them from any intruders. These canoptech constructs were marvels in their own right, machines with enough intelligence to repair damage, eliminate threats, and ensure that the sleeping Necrons would be safe until the time came for them to awaken. The canoptech scarabs were the most numerous of these guardians, small beetle-like machines that flew through the air on anti-gravitation engines. They swarmed through the tomb complexes in their millions, constantly scanning for damage and making repairs. They could dismantle broken machinery atom by atom and reconstruct it perfectly. They could seal breaches in the tomb walls, restore failing power conduits, and maintain the delicate systems that kept the stasis fields operational. In groups, they could even defend the tombs, their swarms capable of disassembling larger machines, and even organic intruders with terrifying efficiency. Larger and more sophisticated were the canoptek spiders, massive arachnoid constructs that served as mobile factories and repair stations. They could manufacture new scarabs as needed, maintain the communication systems that linked different parts of the tomb complex, and tackle more complex repair jobs that were beyond the capabilities of the scarabs. In battle, they were formidable opponents, armed with a variety of weapons and possessing the intelligence to coordinate complex defensive strategies. The canoptek wraiths were specialized constructs designed for navigating the most difficult-to-reach areas of the tomb complexes. They could phase through solid matter, making them ideal for repairing systems that were sealed behind multiple layers of armor or embedded within solid rock. Despite the vigilance of these constructs, the long millennia took their toll. Some tomb worlds suffered catastrophic failures that destroyed vast numbers of sleeping Necrons. Power systems failed, causing stasis fields to collapse and the Necrons within to crumble to dust. Tectonic activity on some worlds caused tomb complexes to be crushed under billions of tons of rock. Cosmic events like supernovas or gamma-ray bursts stripped away planetary atmospheres and irradiated tomb complexes that had not been buried deep enough. The canoptek constructs did their best to repair the damage, but some losses were simply beyond their ability to prevent. Other tomb worlds faced a different kind of threat. As the eons passed, new species evolved and spread across the galaxy. The Aeldari rose to prominence just as the Silent King had predicted, building a vast empire that spanned much of the galaxy. They were aware of the Necrons and the threat they represented, and their seers could sometimes sense the presence of the tomb worlds. On several occasions, Aeldari war hosts descended upon tomb worlds, seeking to destroy the sleeping Necrons before they could awaken and threaten the living. These attacks were not always successful. The tomb world defenses could be formidable even without their masters awake, but they added another source of attrition to the already significant losses the Necrons were suffering. But perhaps the most insidious threat to the sleeping Necrons came not from external forces, but from within. The biotransference had not been a perfect process, and the long millennia of stasis exacerbated problems that had been minor when the Necrons first entered their sleep. Some Necrons suffered what could only be described as digital degradation, their consciousnesses slowly corrupting over the eons until they bore little resemblance to their original selves. This manifested in several forms, each more disturbing than the last. The most infamous of these corruptions was the Flayer virus. During the final battle with the Setan, one of the star gods, Landagor the Flayer, had placed a curse upon the Necrons even as it was being destroyed. The curse was subtle, a spiritual contamination that lay dormant in many Necrons for millions of years before it began to manifest. Those afflicted with the Flayer virus developed an overwhelming obsession with reclaiming the flesh they had lost. They would hunt down organic beings and tear them apart, draping themselves in the bloody remains. Is convinced that by wearing the flesh of others, they could somehow reclaim their own lost humanity. The afflicted Necrons became known as Flayed Ones, and they were shunned by their fellow Necrons as abominations, reminders of everything they had lost. The Flayer virus was not just a physical corruption, it was a spiritual one, and no technology the Necrons possessed could cure it. Another form of degradation affected the highest-ranking Necrons, those who had retained the most of their original personalities. Some of these nobles awoke from their long sleep to find that they had lost large portions of their memories. They could remember their tactics and their duties, but the personal experiences that had defined them as individuals were gone, leaving them as hollow shells playing out roles they no longer truly understood. Others suffered from what could only be described as madness, their mental patterns degrading into obsessive loops or paranoid delusions. For beings that could no longer die naturally, madness was a fate worse than death, an eternal prison from which there was no escape. The Destroyer cult represented perhaps the darkest evolution of Necron psychology during the long sleep. Some Necrons, looking upon what they had become and what they had lost, concluded that the organic life they had once possessed was not a blessing, but a weakness. They embraced their mechanical nature fully, viewing it not as a curse, but as an evolutionary step forward. They developed a burning hatred for all organic life, seeing it as inferior and disgusting. These Necrons modified their bodies, replacing their humanoid forms with more efficient killing machines, as dedicating themselves entirely to the eradication of all life in the galaxy. The Destroyer cult was tolerated by other Necrons because its members were useful in war, but they were also isolated and feared, for their madness was contagious. Other Necrons who spent too much time around Destroyers sometimes found themselves adopting similar viewpoints, their own minds degrading into the same nihilistic hatred. As the millennia passed, the galaxy above the sleeping tomb worlds continued to change. The Eldari Empire reached its zenith and then, in an apocalyptic event that tore reality itself, fell into catastrophe. The birth of a new chaos god, Slaanesh, consumed the Eldari Empire in a single terrible instant, leaving only scattered survivors and creating a wound in reality that would become known as the Eye of Terror. The Eldari, once the dominant force in the galaxy, were reduced to a shadow of their former glory, scattered and desperate, no longer able to threaten the slumbering Necrons, even had they wanted to.
You know, what really strikes me about the Necrons is how fundamentally tragic they are as a faction. Sure, they're terrifying skeletal robots with weapons that can mimic reality, but think about what they've lost. They traded everything that made them alive for the promise of immortality, and what they got was an eternity of hollow existence. Every time I read about a Necron overlord remembering what it was to taste food, or feel the warmth of sunlight on actual skin, it hits differently than any other faction's grimdark elements. The Imperium is brutal, chaos is corrupting, the Tyranids are hungry, but the Necrons, they're living proof that you can win every battle and still lose everything that mattered. They achieved immortality and lost their souls in the process. That's the kind of cosmic horror that makes Warhammer 40k so compelling. They're not just monsters to fight, they're a cautionary tale about the price of ambition wrapped in living metal. Horrifying storytelling, and it's why the Necrons remain one of my favorite factions to explore. But anyways, let's get back to the story.
In the wake of the Eldari's fall, new species began to rise to prominence. The Orcish species, descendants of the Krork warrior race created by the Old Ones, spread across the galaxy in vast hordes, fighting and multiplying wherever they went. Humanity, a species that had barely existed when the Necrons entered their sleep, emerged from their homeworld of terror and began to spread among the stars. There were others as well, the Tau, the Tyranids from beyond the galaxy, and countless minor species, all competing for resources and territory in a galaxy that seemed designed to foster conflict. The tomb worlds slept through it all, their Canoptech guardians maintaining eternal vigil, waiting for the time when their masters would awaken and reclaim their place in the galaxy. And that time, though the Necrons could not know it, was approaching. The first stirrings, when giants begin to wake. The awakening of the Necrons did not happen all at once. There was no cosmic alarm that sounded simultaneously across all tomb worlds, no master signal that activated every stasis crypt at the same moment. Instead, the awakening has been and continues to be a gradual process, with different tomb worlds coming online at different times and for different reasons. This staggered awakening has shaped how the Necrons have reintegrated into the galaxy and influenced their strategies as they've encountered the younger races. The first tomb worlds began to stir approximately 10,000 years before the current era, during what humans would call the Age of Terror and the early stages of the Dark Age of technology. These initial awakenings were premature, triggered not by programmed parameters, but by system malfunctions or external disturbances. A tomb world on the edge of the galaxy might awaken because an asteroid impact damaged its stasis systems. Another might rouse because seismic activity in the planet's crust destabilized the power conduits. These early risers found themselves in a galaxy that had changed dramatically from the one they remembered, but more importantly, they found themselves without leadership or direction. The Silent King was gone, The command protocols had been destroyed, and each tomb world had to make decisions independently as to address the chaos that could have resulted from this uncoordinated awakening. Some of the first Necrons to revive established what became known as the Awakened Council. This political body, based on the tomb world of Bakira, was designed to settle disputes between prematurely awakened dynasties and prevent the kind of civil wars that had plagued the Necrontier before the biotransference. The Awakened Council drew its authority from its association with the Triarch Praetorians, those Necrons who had been granted special status during the reign of the Triarch and who maintained loyalty to the old ways. The council used the vast legal codes of the ancient Necrontier to adjudicate between competing claims and ensure that newly awakened Necrons had a framework within which to operate. The Awakened Council's existence was kept secret from most of the galaxy's younger races. The Necrons who served on it and those who brought disputes before it understood that their species was vulnerable during this period of gradual awakening. Better to remain in the shadows, to carefully assess the situation, than to reveal themselves before they were ready to act decisively. But complete secrecy was impossible. Some of the prematurely awakened tomb worlds came into conflict with the younger races, and word began to spread of strange, seemingly invincible warriors emerging from ancient ruins. During humanity's Great Crusade, that vast expansion, led by the being who would become known as the Emperor of Mankind, Imperial forces encountered Necrons on several occasions. These encounters were baffling to the humans who experienced them. The Necrons would appear seemingly from nowhere, their forces advancing with mechanical precision. They wielded weapons that defied understanding, ghost flayers that stripped matter apart at the molecular level, particle whips that reduced armored vehicles to slag, and hyperphase blades that could cut through any material. When the Imperials fought back, they discovered that destroying the Necron warriors often meant nothing. The fallen would rise again, their bodies reconstructing themselves in flashes of emerald light, or they would simply vanish, teleporting back to their tomb worlds for repair. And then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the Necrons would be gone, withdrawing to their tombs for reasons the Imperials could not fathom. The Imperium initially classified these encounters as conflicts with unknown Xenos raiders, and the information was locked away in the most secure vaults of the Inquisition. The few who had witnessed Necron warriors firsthand and survived gave reports that seemed almost too fantastical to believe. They spoke of skeletal machines that moved with terrifying purpose, of weapons that ignored armor and cover, of foes that could not be truly killed. Some Inquisitors began to investigate more thoroughly, following trails of destroyed colonies and missing expeditions. But before they could fully understand the threat, the Great Crusade ground to a halt with the outbreak of the Horus Heresy, and the Imperium turned its attention to internal conflicts. During the Age of Apostasy, several centuries after the heresy, more tomb worlds awakened. This time, some of them did not simply defend their immediate territory and then return to sleep, but they began to expand, to reclaim territory that had once been part of their ancient domains. On the planet Adric IV, an entire hermitage of the Adeptus Ministorum was wiped out by forces that emerged from the ground itself, skeletal warriors accompanied by larger machines that unleashed beams of energy capable of leveling buildings. Similar attacks occurred across a dozen worlds, all bearing the same characteristics: the sudden appearance of the attackers, the overwhelming firepower, and the complete destruction of all resistance, followed by the attackers' inexplicable withdrawal. The Inquisition, particularly those Inquisitors who specialized in Xenos threats, began to take a more active interest. Inquisitor Bronislaw Chevak, a noted expert on alien civilizations, was one of the first to suggest that these attacks were not the work of multiple different alien species, but rather a single unified threat that had been previously unknown to the Imperium. His research, conducted over several decades, began to piece together a picture of an ancient machine civilization that had lain dormant for an incomprehensible span of time and was now returning to claim the galaxy. The breakthrough came when Imperial forces discovered that the Necrons possessed technology capable of disrupting recording devices. Many sites that had been attacked showed no evidence of their attackers, no pict captures, no Auspex readings, nothing that would allow the Imperials to identify what had struck them. This technology, which the Necrons called disruptor zones, created areas where conventional sensors simply failed to function. Once the Inquisition understood this, they were able to retroactively identify dozens of attacks that had previously been classified as lost to unknown causes as Necron raids. The scope of the threat suddenly became much clearer and much more terrifying. But the Imperium's growing awareness of the Necron threat was still limited to a relative handful of individuals. The vast bureaucracy of the Imperium moved slowly, and information that reached one sector might take decades or centuries to filter to another. More importantly, the Imperium in the early 41st millennium was beset by threats from every direction. The Tyrannid hive fleets were descending upon the galaxy from beyond its rim, consuming entire worlds. The forces of chaos launched repeated Black Crusades from the Eye of Terror. Our orc hordes rose and fell like bloody tides across the galaxy. In the face of all these immediate threats, the Necrons, who still appeared only sporadically and in limited numbers, seemed like just one more danger among many. The Necrons themselves were engaged in their own internal struggles during this period. The Awakened Council, for all its efforts, could not fully prevent conflicts between different dynasties. Some Necron overlords awoke with ambitions of conquest and expansion, viewing other Necron dynasties as rivals to be dominated or destroyed. Others focused on exploring the changed galaxy, trying to understand what had happened during their long sleep and where the younger races had come from. Still others remained in a defensive posture, consolidating their hold on their tomb worlds and the immediate surrounding systems, preparing for a time when they would be strong enough to reclaim their former territories. Without the unifying presence of the Silent King, the Necron dynasties operated independently. This fragmentation worked to the advantage of the younger races. A united Necron force, with all tomb worlds awakened and working in concert, would have posed an existential threat to every other civilization in the galaxy. The Imperium of Man, for all its vast numbers and military might, would have struggled to stand against such a force. But the Necrons were not united. They were divided, often working at cross purposes, and this division gave the younger races time to learn about their enemy and develop strategies for survival. As the 41st millennium progressed, the rate of Necron awakenings accelerated. As more and more tomb worlds were coming online, some according to their original programming, others triggered by external events. The Necrons who had been awake longest began to take more active roles in seeking out and awakening their still dormant brethren. Characters like Anrakir the Traveler became known across Necron society for their efforts to rouse sleeping tomb worlds and bring more of their species back into the galaxy. With each passing decade, the Necron presence in the galaxy grew stronger, more organized, and more dangerous. But the greatest change, the event that would shift the balance of power within Necron society and signal the beginning of a new era, was still to come. The Silent King, that legendary figure who had led the Necrontyr to their doom and then into their long sleep, was returning. And he brought with him news of a threat that would force even the fractious Necron dynasties to consider working together. The awakening process. How tomb worlds come to life. To understand the awakening of the Necrons, we must examine the process itself, the intricate series of events that transforms a silent tomb world into an active military force. This process is not instant, nor is it uniform across all tomb worlds. Each awakening is unique, shaped by the condition of the tomb complex, the sophistication of its master program, and the specific circumstances that trigger the revival sequence. But there are common elements that appear in most awakenings. a pattern that has been observed by those few who have survived encounters with newly awakened tomb worlds. So the process typically begins long before any Necron warrior actually stirs from its stasis crypt. Every tomb world is governed by a master control program, an artificial intelligence of staggering complexity that monitors the status of the tomb and its occupants. This program is constantly, though slowly, processing information from sensors that extend throughout the tomb complex and beyond. It monitors the stasis fields that hold the Necrons in temporal suspension, checking for any signs of degradation or failure. It tracks seismic activity on the planet, watches for signs of cosmic threats like asteroid impacts or solar flares, and maintains awareness of any activity on the planet's surface that might indicate the presence of intruders or potential threats. But the master program operates according to parameters that were set millions of years ago, but with enough flexibility to adapt to unexpected circumstances. If it detects a significant threat to the tomb world, such as a large settlement being built directly above the tomb or an enemy force excavating ancient Necron artifacts, it will begin the first stages of the awakening protocol. These initial stages are subtle and often go unnoticed by any living beings on the planet. Deep within the tomb complex, power systems that have been operating in minimal mode for millions of years begin to ramp up their output. The hum of generators that has been barely perceptible becomes slightly louder. Energy reserves that have been carefully hoarded over the eons are tapped to bring additional systems online. And the first physical manifestations of the awakening are the canoptech constructs. The scarabs that have been maintaining the tomb begin to operate more actively, their numbers swelling as canoptech spiders manufacture new units. These scarabs start venturing out from the tomb complex, emerging onto the planet's surface through hidden access tunnels and vents. Their initial mission is reconnaissance, gathering information about the current state of the planet and identifying any potential threats. They map the locations of any settlements, military installations, or other points of interest. They also begin the process of clearing the way for the larger forces that will follow, removing obstacles, reinforcing weak points in the tomb structure, and eliminating small threats. If the scarabs encounter resistance, they respond with mechanical efficiency. A single scarab is not particularly dangerous to a well-armed soldier, but scarabs rarely operate alone. They move in swarms, and a swarm of scarabs can dismantle a tank or strip an armored warrior to the bone in seconds. Their mandibles can tear through metal and ceramite with equal ease, and their anti-gravitic engines allow them to strike from any angle. For defenders who don't understand what they're facing, the appearance of these scarab swarms is often the first sign that a tomb world is awakening beneath them, and by the time they realize the danger, it's often too late. As the scarab swarms do their work, larger canoptech constructs begin to activate. Canoptech spiders emerge from the depths, their massive forms dwarfing the scarabs they command. But these spiders serve multiple functions during the awakening. They continue the manufacturing process, producing more scarabs and other constructs as needed. They also begin repairing any damage to the tomb complex itself, using their sophisticated tools to restore systems that may have degraded during the long sleep. And when necessary, they serve as heavy weapons platforms, their particle beamers and other exotic weapons capable of destroying hard targets that might threaten the awakening process. Canoptech wraiths, those sinister constructs that can phase through solid matter, begin patrolling the tomb complex and its surroundings. They hunt for intruders who might have penetrated into areas where the scarabs cannot easily reach. A wraith can pass through walls, floors, and even solid rock as if they weren't there, emerging without warning to strike at enemies with their phase claws and particle weapons. They are particularly effective at eliminating enemy scouts and infiltrators, those who might try to gather intelligence about the awakening tomb or plant explosives in critical locations. This initial phase of the awakening, dominated by canoptech constructs, can last for days, weeks, or even months, depending on the specific circumstances. The master program is patient and thorough. It wants to ensure that the tomb complex is fully secure and that all systems are operating within acceptable parameters before it begins reviving the Necrons themselves. During this time, defenders on the planet's surface often underestimate the threat they face. Or they may view the scarab swarms and canoptech constructs as merely a particularly dangerous form of native fauna, or perhaps automated defenses from some ancient civilization. The true horror is yet to come. The next phase begins when the master program determines that conditions are suitable for the first actual Necrons to awaken. It starts with the lowest ranking warriors, those Necrons who retained the least of their original consciousness during the biotransference. These warriors are essentially automatons, capable of following orders and executing tactical maneuvers, but possessing almost no individual personality or initiative. The stasis fields that have held them frozen for millions of years flicker and fade. The warriors' optical sensors glow with an eerie emerald light as their systems come online. They rise from their alcoves, taking up weapons that have been stored beside them for eons, and begin forming into coherent units under the direction of the master program. These first warriors serve multiple purposes. They provide additional defensive capabilities beyond what the canoptech constructs can offer, particularly in terms of ranged firepower. A Necron warrior, armed with a Gauss flare, can lay down a withering field of fire that will strip apart enemy infantry and light vehicles with terrifying efficiency. The warriors also serve as a test of the tomb's systems. The master program monitors them carefully, checking for any signs of degradation or malfunction. If a warrior's resurrection protocol fails to function properly, or if its weapon systems don't calibrate correctly, this provides valuable data that the program can use to adjust its procedures before awakening more valuable and complex Necrons. The warriors are sent out from the tomb complex in raiding parties, groups of 10 to 20 warriors accompanied by scarab swarms and perhaps a canoptech construct or two. These raiders probe the defenses of any settlements or military installations on the planet, gathering tactical data and eliminating enemy forces wherever possible. The raids also serve a psychological purpose. The sight of skeletal metal warriors advancing with implacable purpose, shrugging off wounds that would kill a living being, can break the morale of defenders and cause them to make mistakes or even flee entirely. One of the most disturbing aspects of fighting Necron warriors during this phase is the reanimation protocol. When a warrior is destroyed, its body doesn't simply fall and remain down. Instead, it begins to glow with an eerie green light. Nanomachines swarm over its form, knitting severed limbs back together, repairing shattered torsos, and reconstructing destroyed skulls. Within moments, what had been a pile of broken metal is once again a fully functional warrior, rising to rejoin the battle. Warriors that are too damaged to repair on the battlefield simply vanish, teleported back to the tomb world where more extensive repairs can be carried out. This means that casualties inflicted on Necron forces during the awakening are often temporary, a fact that can be deeply demoralizing for defenders who watch the same enemies they've destroyed come back again and again. As the awakening continues, more sophisticated Necrons begin to revive. Immortals, who were once the professional soldiers and minor nobles of the Necrontyr, awaken next. These warriors retained more of their consciousness than the basic warriors and are capable of more complex tactical thinking. They often serve as squad leaders and tactical coordinators, directing the movements of the warrior formations and adapting to enemy tactics in real time. Immortals are also equipped with more powerful weapons than basic warriors, carrying Gauss blasters or Tesla carbines capable of devastating enemy forces. The next layer of the hierarchy to awaken consists of the more specialized forces. Lich Guard, the elite bodyguards of Necron nobles, emerge from their stasis crypts, clad in enhanced armor and wielding war scythes or hyperphase swords. Deathmarks, long-range assassins, take up their positions, their dimensional chambers allowing them to phase in and out of reality to strike at enemy leaders. Triarch Praetorians, those warriors who maintained loyalty to the old Triarchate system, activate and begin to assert their authority. Each of these specialized units brings new capabilities to the awakening tomb world's forces, allowing for more complex and effective military operations. Only after all of these lesser Necrons have been successfully awakened does the master program begin the process of reviving the nobility. This is the most critical phase of the awakening, because the nobles, particularly the overlords, who command entire tomb worlds, and the pharaoh, who rules over dynasties comprising many worlds, are where the true power and personality of the Necrons resides. So these individuals retained far more of their original consciousness than any of the lower-ranking Necrons. They can think strategically, plan for the long term, and make the kinds of decisions that automated programs cannot. But they are also more complex, which means there's more that can go wrong during their revival. A Necron Lord awakens within its sarcophagus-like stasis crypt, its enhanced body coming online system by system. Its optical sensors activate first, giving it a view of the interior of its tomb, likely the first thing it has seen in millions of years. Its consciousness, which has been compressed to barely a spark during the long sleep, expands and begins reasserting control over its mechanical form. Memory engrams are accessed and verified. Tactical databases are loaded. Command protocols are initialized. Yet the entire process might take only minutes, but to the awakening Lord, it can feel like an eternity as it struggles to reconcile its memories of the ancient past with the reality of its current mechanical existence. When a Necron noble fully awakens, one of its first actions is typically to establish contact with other awakened Necrons and take command of military operations. The master program, for all its sophistication, is not equipped to handle the complex decision-making required for large-scale military campaigns or political maneuvering. That requires a true intelligence, something with the capacity for creativity and adaptation that only the higher-ranking Necrons possess. The noble will review the tactical situation, assess the strengths and weaknesses of both its own forces and any enemies on the world, and begin issuing orders. What for tomb worlds where the awakening has gone smoothly, this can be the beginning of a rapid expansion. The Necron forces, now under the command of their nobility, can coordinate complex military operations. They can strike at multiple targets simultaneously, adapt their tactics based on enemy responses, and make use of their full array of advanced technologies. Tomb complexes deep beneath the planet's surface open their primary gates, and the full might of the tomb world begins to emerge. Heavy constructs like Canoptech Doomstalkers and Tombstalkers crawl forth from the depths. Anti-gravitation platforms rise into the air, carrying Necron warriors and lords into battle. And the truly massive engines of war, the monoliths and obelisks, begin their ponderous march. But their presence on the battlefield a signal that the Necrons are no longer merely defending their tomb, but are ready to reclaim the entire world. But not all awakenings proceed smoothly. Some tomb worlds awaken to find that critical systems have failed, that large portions of their military forces are beyond repair, or that the nobles themselves have been damaged by the long sleep. An overlord might awaken to find its memory engrams corrupted, leaving it confused about its identity and purpose. A pharaoh might discover that the other nobles of its dynasty have been destroyed or driven mad, leaving it as the sole remaining leader of a fractured and weakened force. In such cases, the awakening can be chaotic and disorganized, with different factions of Necrons pursuing contradictory goals or falling into internecine conflicts. There are also tomb worlds where the awakening is triggered prematurely or under adverse conditions. Perhaps enemy forces have discovered the tomb and are actively trying to destroy it. Perhaps a massive natural disaster has damaged the tomb complex, forcing the master program to awaken what forces it can in a desperate attempt at survival. In these emergency awakenings, the careful, staged process is abandoned in favor of speed. Warriors and even nobles might be awakened in large groups simultaneously, without the thorough system checks that would normally precede each stage. This can lead to higher rates of malfunction and degradation, but it may be the only way for the tomb world to survive the immediate threat. The final stage of a tomb world's awakening involves its full integration into the wider Necron society. Once the local situation has been stabilized and the world secured, The awakened Necrons will typically begin the process of contacting other tomb worlds within their dynasty, and eventually, other dynasties as well. This can be a complex process because the communication networks that once spanned the Necron Empire have largely broken down during the millions of years of sleep. New connections must be established, old alliances verified or renegotiated, and the current political landscape of Necron society navigated. For tomb worlds that awaken in isolation, cut off from contact with others of their kind, the experience can be particularly disorienting. They may not know if other Necrons still exist, if the galaxy has moved on without them, or what threats they might face. Yet these isolated tomb worlds often adopt a highly defensive posture, focusing on securing their immediate region and building up their forces before attempting to expand or make contact with others. Over time, as more tomb worlds awaken and the communication networks are rebuilt, these isolated Necrons are typically reintegrated into the wider dynasties, though the process can take decades or even centuries. The awakening of a tomb world is not just a military event. It is also a moment of profound significance for the Necrons themselves. Every Necron who awakens must confront anew the reality of what they have become, must grapple with the loss of their organic forms and the millennia they have lost to the sleep. For the warriors and immortals, with their limited consciousness, this is a relatively simple process. But for the nobles, who remember more of what they once were, the awakening can be a time of deep existential crisis. They awaken to find that the galaxy has changed beyond recognition, that species that didn't exist when they went to sleep now dominate vast territories, and that their own people are diminished and scattered. Some nobles handle this with stoic acceptance, focusing on the practical work of rebuilding their power. Others fall into despair or rage, their damaged psyches unable to cope with the magnitude of what has been lost. And a very few, begin to wonder if perhaps the Silent King's decision to sleep was a mistake, if perhaps it would have been better to have fought to extinction rather than become the diminished things they now are. At the Silent King's return, a new purpose. If the awakening of the tomb worlds represents the stirring of a sleeping giant, then the return of the Silent King represents the moment when that giant opens its eyes and truly sees the galaxy around it for the first time in millions of years. Zarek, the last of the Silent Kings, the being who led his people into biotransference and then commanded them to sleep, had imposed upon himself an exile that took him beyond the boundaries of the galaxy itself. For millions of years, he wandered the intergalactic void, the empty space between galaxies where no stars shine and no worlds exist, bearing the weight of what he had done and seeking, perhaps, some form of redemption or understanding that could not be found within the galaxy he had abandoned. The void between galaxies is not truly empty, but it is one of the loneliest places in the universe. A few rogue stars, ejected from their galaxies by gravitational interactions, drift through the darkness. Ancient brown dwarves, stars that never quite achieved the mass necessary to sustain fusion, radiate dim heat into the cosmic night. And, though none of the younger races know this, vast swarms of living ships swim through the void, drawn by the light of galaxies like moths to a flame. These are the Tyranids, the great devourer, an extragalactic threat that consumes all biomass it encounters and grows stronger with every world it devours. Zarek encountered the Tyranids somewhere in that vast darkness between galaxies. Perhaps he was drawn to investigate the strange phenomena of these vast bioships. Perhaps they sensed his presence and moved to investigate this strange mechanical being in the emptiness between their hunting grounds. However it happened, the Silent King came to understand the nature of the Tyranid threat and recognized immediately how dangerous it was, not just to the younger races, but to the Necrons themselves. The Tyranids consume everything. When they arrive at a world, they do not simply kill the inhabitants. They harvest every scrap of biomass, from the largest predators down to the smallest microorganisms. They strip away the vegetation, drain the oceans, and leave behind a dead rock utterly devoid of life. For most species, this is simply extinction. But for the Necrons, it represented something far more threatening, and it represented the permanent destruction of any hope they might have of reversing the biotransference. The Silent King, despite everything, had never completely abandoned the dream of returning his people to flesh and blood. It was this hope, distant and perhaps impossible, that had sustained him through his long exile. The plan, such as it was, required the existence of suitable organic life forms, whose bodies might serve as templates or vessels for Necron consciousness. If the Tyranids consumed all biomass in the galaxy, there would be nothing left to work with. The Necrons would be trapped in their mechanical forms forever, with no possibility of ever reclaiming what they had lost. This realization drove Zarek to make a decision that would have profound consequences for the entire galaxy. He would return, but he would seek out his people, rally them to a common cause, and lead them in a war against the Tyranids. It was not altruism that motivated him. He cared nothing for the younger races, and would happily see them destroyed if it served his purposes. But he could not allow the Tyranids to consume the galaxy unopposed, because doing so would doom his people to eternal damnation in their metal shells. The Silent King returned to the galaxy in the year 744 of the 41st Millennium, by the Imperial calendar, though this dating means nothing to the Necrons. What he found upon his return must have been simultaneously familiar and alien. The basic structure of the galaxy was unchanged, the same spiral arms, the same great rift at the galactic core that would later tear open even wider. But the civilizations that populated it were completely different from what he remembered. The Aeldari, who had been the dominant power when the Necrons went to sleep, were now reduced to scattered fragments, living either on massive craft worlds that drifted through the void or in the dark city of Komarach, hidden in the webway. Humanity, which had barely existed as a spacefaring species when the Necrons slumbered, now controlled the largest empire in the galaxy. Millions of worlds united under the banner of the God Emperor and the Imperium of man. But most disturbing to the Silent King was the state of his own people. The Necrons had awakened piecemeal, without coordination or unified leadership. Many tomb worlds remained in stasis, their populations unaware of the threats that now surrounded them. Those that had awakened were scattered and often at odds with each other. Dynastic rivalries that dated back to before the biotransference had flared up again. Some Necron overlords sought to establish their own mini-empires, caring nothing for the wider fate of their species. Others had fallen into madness or obsession, their long sleep having damaged them in ways that could not be repaired. Zarek understood immediately that he could not simply announce his return and expect all Necrons to rally to him. The command protocols that had once allowed the Triarch absolute authority over all Necrons had been destroyed by his own hand before he entered exile. He had done this intentionally, freeing his people from the slavery that had been imposed by the biotransference, but it meant that he now had no automatic claim to authority over them. Yet he would have to earn their loyalty, prove himself worthy of leading them once again, and convince them that the threat he had identified was more important than their individual ambitions. The Silent King's initial approach was subtle. He worked through intermediaries, using the Triarch Praetorians, those Necrons who still held loyalty to the old system, to influence other Necrons without revealing his own presence. He manipulated events from the shadows, guiding certain overlords toward decisions that would benefit the wider Necron species while allowing them to believe the choices were their own. He used cryptechs, those Necron technical specialists who could be bought with promises of ancient knowledge or rare artifacts, to spread information and influence technological developments across multiple dynasties. As he worked, the Silent King also conducted a careful survey of the galaxy's current state. He needed to understand the younger races, their strengths, their weaknesses, and how they might be used or manipulated to serve his purposes. Humanity's Imperium was vast but bureaucratic and slow to adapt. The Aeldari were wise but few in number and divided among themselves. The emerging Tau Empire was technologically sophisticated but naive about the true darkness of the galaxy. Each represented both a potential threat and a potential tool that could be used in the war against the Tyranids. It was during this period of observation and manipulation that the Silent King made a discovery that would shape his future strategies. He learned of an ancient alliance, or perhaps a near alliance, that had almost been formed 10,000 years earlier. Before the Horus heresy that had nearly destroyed the Imperium, before the Emperor of Mankind had been interred upon the Golden Throne, there had been contact between Necron forces and none other than Sanguinius, Primarch of the Blood Angels Space Marine Legion. The exact nature of this contact has been lost to history, but the Silent King's own records suggest that there had been discussions, perhaps even negotiations, towards some form of mutual understanding or cooperation. This precedent gave Zarek an idea. If the Necrons had once been able to communicate with humanity's greatest heroes, perhaps such communication could be established again. Not as equals, certainly. The Necrons viewed the younger races as children at best, but as temporary allies against a greater threat. The Tyranids threatened all life in the galaxy. Surely, even the primitive younger races could understand that and be willing to cooperate, at least temporarily, to ensure mutual survival. The test of this theory came at a world called Gehenna. A Tyranid splinter fleet had arrived in the system, and both Necron and Blood Angels forces were present. The situation was complex. The Necrons had already been attacking the world, seeking to cleanse it of the human population they viewed as squatters on what had once been Necron territory. The Blood Angels had arrived to defend the human civilians and repel the Necron assault. But when the Tyranids descended upon the system, both sides faced annihilation. The Silent King, working through intermediaries and then eventually making his presence known, proposed a temporary alliance. The Necrons and Blood Angels would cooperate to destroy the Tyranid threat, and then they would settle their differences afterward. To the Blood Angels' credit, their commander, the legendary Dante, who bore a death mask similar to that worn by Sanguinius himself, agreed. The alliance was tense, with both sides fully aware that they would likely turn on each other the moment the Tyranids were dealt with, but it held long enough to achieve its purpose. The combined forces of Necrons and Blood Angels were devastating. The Necrons provided superior firepower and tactics, their Gauss weapons and particle beamers cutting through Tyranid swarms like wheat before a scythe. The Blood Angels brought their unmatched close combat expertise and their fierce determination, holding the line against Tyranid charges that would have overwhelmed lesser defenders. When the battle was won and the Tyranids had been driven from the system, both sides withdrew, battered but alive. The Silent King ensured that the Blood Angels survived the encounter, seeing value in maintaining the possibility of future cooperation, even if he had no qualms about sacrificing them, had it been necessary for victory. This alliance at Gehenna served multiple purposes for the Silent King. It demonstrated to other Necrons that cooperation with the younger races was possible when it served Necron interests. It provided valuable data on how Tyranid forces could be effectively combated, and it established a precedent that the Silent King could reference when arguing for his strategic vision, that the Necrons should focus first on the Tyranid threat and only afterward turn their full attention to conquering or destroying the younger races. Following the events at Gehenna, the Silent King began to make his presence more widely known among Necron society. He chose two pharaons from minor dynasties, Hapthatra, the Radiant, and Mesophet, the Shadowed Hand, to serve as his new triarch. These two Necrons were integrated into his Dais of Dominion, a massive floating platform that served as both his throne and his command center. The Dais itself was powered by a captured shard of the Satan Nyadrazatha, demonstrating the Silent King's continued mastery of even the most dangerous Necron technologies. Once integrated into the Dais, Hapthatra and Mesophet began to speak with a single voice, yet their individual identities subsumed into their role as the mouthpiece of the Silent King, just as the original Triarch had operated millions of years before. With his new Triarch established and his presence known, Zarek began the work of unifying the Necron dynasties. He traveled from tomb world to tomb world, sometimes openly, sometimes in disguise or through intermediaries. He met with pharaohs and overlords, making his case for why they should acknowledge his leadership. He spoke of the Tyranid threat and the need for coordination. He reminded them of past glories and promised future ones. He offered rewards to those who would ally with him and implied consequences for those who would stand against him. Most importantly, he offered purpose and direction to Necrons who had awakened into a confusing and hostile galaxy with no clear sense of what they should do next. Not all Necrons accepted the Silent King's leadership. Imhotep the Stormlord, Pharaoh of the Sautek dynasty, and arguably the most powerful Necron overlord in terms of military might, viewed Sarek's return with skepticism bordering on hostility. Imhotep had his own ambitions for unifying the Necron race under his banner, and he did not appreciate the Silent King's interference. More fundamentally, Imhotep disagreed with Zarek's ultimate goal. The Silent King wanted to reverse the biotransference, to return the Necrons to organic form. Imhotep viewed their mechanical bodies not as a curse, but as an improvement, as an evolutionary step forward that had made them superior to the weak flesh beings who now infested the galaxy. This philosophical disagreement would eventually lead to open conflict during what became known as the War of the Pariah Nexus. But in the early years of the Silent King's return, Imhotep was content to maintain a position of wary neutrality. He would not actively oppose Zarek, but neither would he acknowledge the Silent King's authority over the Sautek dynasty. This set a pattern that would be repeated across many dynasties, with different Necron leaders taking positions ranging from enthusiastic support to outright hostility, with most falling somewhere in the middle. The Silent King's strategy during this period showed the wisdom and patience that had made him such an effective leader even before the biotransference, as he did not demand absolute obedience or immediate action. Instead, he built a coalition of the willing, focusing on those dynasties and tomb worlds that were receptive to his message. He allowed those who wished to remain independent to do so, at least for the time being, calculating that as his successes mounted, more would be drawn to his banner. And he carefully husbanded his resources, understanding that the war against the Tyranids would be a long one, requiring sustained effort across multiple fronts. As the 41st millennium drew to a close, and the galaxy plunged into the chaos that followed the opening of the Great Rift, the Silent King's influence among the Necrons continued to grow. His warnings about the threats facing the galaxy seemed increasingly prescient as Tyranid fleets multiplied. Their chaos incursions became more frequent, and the younger races descended into ever more desperate conflicts. More and more Necron leaders came to see value in the coordination and purpose that the Silent King offered. The Zarakhan dynasty, the Silent King's own ancestral dynasty, rose to prominence, its power growing to rival even that of the Sautek. The dream of a unified Necron empire, working in concert to reclaim the galaxy, began to seem less like a fantasy and more like a genuine possibility. But unity among the Necrons remained elusive. Too much time had passed, too much had been lost, and the damage done to Necron psyches by the biotransference and the long sleep was not easily repaired. The Silent King could influence and guide, could cajole and persuade, but he could not command as he once had. The Necrons were free, for better or worse, and they would exercise that freedom even if it meant working at cross purposes or descending into internecine conflict. The Silent King's return had given the Necrons a chance at true unity and purpose, but whether they would seize that chance or squander it in petty conflicts remained to be seen. The Great Dynasties: Rise, Power, and Ambition. The awakening of the Necrons has not been uniform, and neither has the power that different dynasties wield in the modern era. The ancient hierarchy of Necron society, established millions of years before their Great Sleep, has reasserted itself, but with significant changes. Some dynasties that were powerful in the ancient past have been nearly destroyed by the ravages of time, and others that were minor players have risen to prominence through good fortune, or the brilliance of their leaders. Understanding the major Necron dynasties is crucial to understanding the broader picture of Necron resurgence, for these dynasties shape not only Necron strategy, but the very future of the galaxy. The Sautekh dynasty stands as perhaps the most powerful and aggressive of all the awakened Necron forces. Ruled from the crown world of Mandragora by Pharaoh Imhotep, the Stormlord, the Sautekh control over 100 tomb worlds and have been expanding their territory with relentless efficiency. What makes the Sautekh particularly formidable is not just their numbers, though those are impressive, but the strategic genius of their leader. Imhotep, the Stormlord, earned his epithet through his ability to manipulate the fundamental forces of nature itself, calling down storms of dark energy upon his enemies, and using weather as a weapon of war in ways that even other Necrons find impressive. Imhotep's rise to power was far from certain. During the Great Sleep, the original Pharaoh of the Sautekh dynasty succumbed to the ravages of entropy, his consciousness degrading to the point where resurrection was impossible. When the time came for the Sautekh to awaken, they found themselves without a clear leader. Various members of the royal court began vying for the position, each believing they had the best claim to the throne. The tomb world of Mandragora erupted into civil war, as with different factions of Necrons fighting each other, while the dynasty's territories lay vulnerable to external threats. Imhotep had been a renowned general even before the biotransference, known for his tactical brilliance and his ruthless prosecution of campaigns. His stasis crypt was thought to have been destroyed in the initial fighting during the Civil War, which only encouraged the various pretenders to fight more fiercely, believing they no longer had to worry about his potential challenge. But Imhotep had survived, and when he awoke to find his dynasty tearing itself apart, his rage was terrible to behold. He rallied an army from those Necrons still loyal to the concept of unified command and systematically destroyed each of the pretenders, at defeating them not through superior numbers, but through tactical superiority that made their efforts seem clumsy and disorganized by comparison. Once Imhotep had secured his position as pharaoh, he began the work of rebuilding and expanding the Sautekh dynasty with a systematic approach that has become his hallmark. He analyzed the state of the galaxy, identified threats and opportunities, and developed long-term strategic plans that encompassed not just single battles or campaigns, but entire sectors of space. His campaigns are known for their logical progression, each action flowing naturally from the last, creating momentum that becomes almost impossible for enemies to counter. Only species that operate without logic, like the Orcish hordes or the chaotic forces of the warp, have proven capable of throwing off his predictions and causing him difficulty. The Sautekh dynasty's expansion has been greatly aided by what Imhotep calls his requisition of other tomb worlds. When the Sautekh encounter a tomb world from a lesser dynasty, Imhotep offers its leaders a choice: join the Sautekh willingly and maintain a degree of autonomy, or be conquered and absorbed completely. Most choose to join, recognizing that Imhotep's strategic acumen and the Sautekh's resources offer them a better chance of survival and success than trying to stand alone. This has allowed the Sautekh to grow at a rate that far exceeds what would be possible through awakening their own tomb worlds alone. But Imhotep's greatest strength is also, ironically, his greatest weakness. Yet his reliance on logical analysis and predictable patterns means that he struggles against enemies who don't operate according to rational principles. Orcish hordes, with their love of random violence and their complete disregard for their own survival, regularly frustrate his carefully laid plans. Chaos forces, empowered by the unpredictable energies of the warp, can perform actions that seem to violate the fundamental laws of physics, throwing off his calculations. And now, with the return of the Silent King, Imhotep faces a different kind of challenge, a potential rival for leadership of the entire Necron species. In stark contrast to the aggressive expansionism of the Sautekh stands the Nihilakh dynasty. Where the Sautekh look outward, seeking new territories to conquer, the Nihilakh look inward, are obsessed with reclaiming and restoring their ancient holdings to their former glory. The Nihilach were once one of the greatest dynasties, controlling vast territories and wielding significant influence within the Necron Empire. But the long sleep was particularly unkind to them. Many of their tomb worlds suffered catastrophic failures, and when they awoke, they found their crown world nearly destroyed and much of their territory occupied by younger races who had no idea they were squatting on ancient Necron lands. The current leadership of the Nihilach has taken a somewhat defensive but still highly aggressive posture. They focus primarily on reclaiming their lost territories, and they view any non-Necron presence on what was once Nihilach space as a personal insult that must be avenged. This makes them particularly dangerous to the Imperium and other younger races because Nihilach forces will launch campaigns to cleanse entire sectors simply because those sectors were once under Nihilach control, regardless of whether there's any strategic value in doing so. To the Nihilach, this is not conquest, it is rightful reclamation, and they will not rest until every world that once flew their colors does so again. The Nihilach have an interesting technological edge that has aided their efforts at reclamation. They possess the preserved head of something called the Ithseer, an entity of unknown origin whose prophetic abilities have been preserved through Necron technology. This artifact grants the Nihilach's leaders access to a degree of precognition, allowing them to anticipate enemy actions and plan their campaigns with uncanny foresight. While not as reliable or all-encompassing as true prophecy, the prescience gleaned from the Ithseer has proven invaluable in helping the Nihilach prioritize which worlds to reclaim first and how to most efficiently use their limited resources. The Mefrit dynasty has earned a reputation as perhaps the most destructive of all the awakened Necron forces. In the ancient past, they served as the executioners of the Necron Empire, the dynasty that was called upon when worlds needed to be not just conquered, but utterly annihilated. This role has shaped their technology and their psychology. The Mefrit possess some of the most powerful weapons in the Necron arsenal, including devices capable of destabilizing stars and causing them to go supernova, and destroying entire solar systems in the process. Their entire military doctrine is built around the principle of overwhelming firepower, of bringing to bear such devastating, destructive capacity that resistance becomes not just futile, but impossible. When Mefrit forces take the field, the very air seems to crackle with barely contained energy. Their weapons glow with an intensity that other Necron technology lacks. Their soldiers advance with the confidence of warriors who know that they wield the power to unmake worlds. Facing the Mefrit is a uniquely terrifying experience because their goal is not conquest or subjugation, but total annihilation. They do not leave survivors to tell tales or ruins that might one day be rebuilt. They reduce everything they encounter to its component atoms and then move on to the next target. The Novok dynasty takes a different approach to warfare, one that many other Necrons find disturbing even by their standards. The Novok specialize in close-quarters combat, which is unusual for Necrons, who generally prefer to destroy their enemies at range with their superior technology. But the Novok have developed a doctrine that emphasizes melee combat, using hyperphase blades and war scythes to carve through enemy formations in a manner that can only be described as butchery. More disturbingly, the Novok have developed a practice of covering themselves in the blood and gore of their victims, using the viscera of the organic races as a kind of war paint. This behavior is not simply barbarism, though it certainly appears that way to external observers. For the Novok, the act of covering themselves in organic material represents a twisted attempt to reclaim some sense of their lost flesh and blood existence. They know they can never truly return to organic form, but surrounding themselves with the evidence of organic life, even in its most gruesome form, provides them with some psychological comfort. Other Necrons view this practice with disgust, seeing it as a sign of degradation and perhaps a precursor to the kind of madness that afflicts the flayed ones. But the Novok are undeniably effective in combat. and their brutal tactics have proven successful in campaigns where a more conventional approach might have failed. The Nephrek dynasty has taken perhaps the most unusual path of all the major dynasties. They have embraced their mechanical nature in a way that most Necrons have not, viewing their transformation not as a curse, but as a step toward an even greater form of existence. The Nephrek believe they are evolving toward a state of being made of pure energy, beings of living light that would transcend the limitations of both flesh and metal. Their crown world orbits a trinary star system, and the Nephrek have developed technology that allows them to absorb and store solar energy in ways that other Necrons cannot. This absorption of solar energy has physical manifestations. Nephrek Necrons glow with an inner luminescence, their bodies sheathed in a golden radiance that grows stronger the more energy they absorb. They have also developed what they call translocation technology to an art form, able to manipulate their molecular structure to phase in and out of reality, appearing and disappearing in flashes of light that their enemies find profoundly unsettling. The Nephrek's ultimate goal, if they speak truthfully about it, is to transcend physical form entirely, to become beings of pure energy that exist beyond the material universe. Whether this is achievable or merely a collective delusion born of their damaged psyches remains to be seen. The Sarkhan dynasty has, with the return of the Silent King, become one of the most politically significant dynasties, despite not having the military strength of the Sautek, or the technological specialization of some others. This is the Silent King's own dynasty, the ancestral house from which Zarek himself comes, and his return has elevated it to a position of prominence it had not held since before the Great Sleep. On other Necrons who wish to curry favor with the Silent King, or who genuinely believe in his vision for the Necron species, have flocked to the Sarkhan banner, strengthening it considerably. The Sarkhan are characterized by their focus on unity and coordination among Necron forces. Where other dynasties pursue their own agendas, sometimes to the detriment of the wider Necron species, the Sarkhan work to build alliances and foster cooperation. They possess ancient technologies and knowledge that were thought lost, resources that the Silent King preserved during his long exile, and they have the backing of the Triarch Praetorians, those Necrons who maintain loyalty to the old Triarchate system and who see in Zarek's return the possibility of restoring the glory of the ancient Necron Empire. But the Sarkhan face challenges that other dynasties do not. Every action they take is scrutinized by other Necrons who fear that the Silent King is trying to re-establish the absolute authority he once held. The command protocols that once allowed the Triarch to control all Necrons are gone, but many fear that Zarek is working to create new forms of control that would be equally effective. The Sarkhan must constantly balance their efforts to unite the Necrons against the reality that too heavy-handed an approach will drive other dynasties into opposition or even rebellion. Beyond these major dynasties, there are dozens of lesser dynasties and independent tomb worlds, each with their own character and goals. That the Charnovok dynasty awoke to find Tyranids actively feeding on their tomb world and have since dedicated themselves to hunting the Great Devourer wherever it can be found. The Ogdebek dynasty maintained close relationships with Cryptex before the sleep and awoke to find much of their advanced technology still functional, giving them an edge in certain types of warfare. The Altimhor dynasty has taken the unusual step of keeping non-Necron slaves, organic beings who serve the dynasty in roles that the Necrons find beneath them, though whether these slaves are kept alive or are somehow preserved in stasis is unclear. The diversity among the Necron dynasties is both a strength and a weakness. It means that the Necrons as a whole are highly adaptable, able to bring different strengths and specializations to bear against different threats. But it also means that unified action is difficult, that coordinating even a majority of Necron forces toward a common goal requires extensive negotiation and compromise. The Silent King's great challenge, and perhaps his ultimate test as a leader, will be whether he can harness this diversity and forge it into a unified force, or whether the Necrons will remain forever fractured, powerful, but unable to realize their full potential because of internal divisions. Masters of the Tomb Worlds, the heroes and monsters. Within the hierarchy of Necron society, certain individuals have risen to prominence, earning names and reputations that echo across the galaxy. These Necrons have retained enough of their original personalities and intellects to be true individuals rather than mere automatons. They pursue their own agendas, form their own alliances, and in some cases, work at cross-purposes with each other, even when they nominally serve the same dynasty. Understanding these key figures provides crucial insight into Necron motivations and the varied forms that the Necron threat can take. Imhotep the Stormlord, whom we have already discussed in connection with the Sautek dynasty, deserves further examination as perhaps the most dangerous Necron military commander currently active in the galaxy. His epithet comes not from metaphor, but from a very literal ability to manipulate storm systems, calling down lightning from the sky and shrouding battlefields in darkness to blind his enemies, while his own forces, with their superior sensors, remain unaffected. But it is not his weather control that makes him truly dangerous. It is his mind, and his ability to analyze any tactical situation and devise the optimal response, often several steps ahead of what his enemies are considering. Imhotep has one notable quirk that has shaped many of his campaigns. When he defeats an enemy commander in single combat, which he often seeks out as a matter of honor and tradition, he does not kill them. Instead, he mutilates them, typically taking a hand as a trophy, and then allows them to live. The message is clear. He wants his defeated enemies to survive so they can spread word of his superiority, so they can live with the humiliation of their defeat and the knowledge that they survived only because Imhotep allowed it. This practice has created a collection of maimed but living enemies across the galaxy, from the Black Templar High Marshal Helbrecht, who lost his hand to Imhotep on the world of Schrödinger 7, to the Eldar Farseer Eldorath Starbane, who lost his hand at the Siege of Somenor. But this practice also represents Imhotep's one true weakness. His pride and his desire for these trophies mean that he will spare enemies who might be more effectively eliminated. Helbrecht, after recovering from his defeat, launched a revenge attack on Imhotep's tomb ship and nearly succeeded in destroying the Stormlord. Logan Grimnar of the Space Wolves managed to defeat Imhotep in battle, though the circumstances of that fight remain somewhat mysterious. These setbacks have not diminished Imhotep's power or his reputation, but they serve as reminders that even the greatest of Necron strategists is not infallible. And at the opposite end of the spectrum from Imhotep's military pragmatism stands Trazyn the Infinite, perhaps the most unusual Necron in existence. Trazyn is an archaeologist, a collector, and by his own estimation, the galaxy's most dedicated preservationist of history. Where other Necrons focus on conquest or the pursuit of power, Trazyn is obsessed with gathering artifacts, specimens, and even entire moments in time, preserving them in his vast galleries on the tomb world of Solemnes. His collection is truly staggering in its scope. He possesses artifacts from every era of galactic history, specimens of extinct species preserved in stasis, and even living individuals frozen in time, captured at moments of historical significance. Trazyn's methods of acquiring additions to his collection range from the straightforward to the baroque, and sometimes he will simply purchase or trade for items he wants, offering other rare artifacts or valuable information in exchange. Other times he will steal what he desires, deploying his Necron forces not to conquer, but to raid specific locations and acquire specific objects. He has been known to manipulate entire wars and campaigns, guiding events toward outcomes that will allow him to acquire particularly rare specimens. During the final defense of Cadia against the 13th Black Crusade of Chaos, Trazyn intervened on the side of the Imperium, not out of any love for humanity, but because he recognized that a Chaos victory would likely result in the destruction of many unique and irreplaceable artifacts. What makes Trazyn particularly difficult to deal with is his use of surrogate bodies. Trazyn rarely fights in person, instead transferring his consciousness into other Necron bodies, some of which are his own constructs, while others are actual Necron nobles whom he has temporarily possessed. This means that destroying what appears to be Trazyn often means nothing. The real Trazyn is somewhere else entirely, watching the battle and adjusting his strategies. He has been known to possess even high-ranking Necrons without their knowledge, using their resources and authority for his own purposes before withdrawing and leaving them confused about what they've been doing. Trazyn's collection includes some items that other factions would very much like to acquire or destroy. He possesses a preserved specimen of an enslaver, one of those parasitic entities that nearly destroyed the galaxy at the end of the War in Heaven. He has fragments of technology from the old ones themselves, items of almost incalculable value to archaeologists and historians. He even claims to have a Primarch in his collection, though which Primarch and under what circumstances they were acquired remains a closely guarded secret. The galleries of Solemnes are perhaps the greatest repository of galactic history in existence, surpassing even the Black Library of the Eldari, but they are also deeply dangerous because Trazyn guards his collection jealously and has destroyed entire armies to protect particularly prized possessions. If Trazyn represents the Necrons' capacity for scholarly obsession, then Orican the Diviner represents their mastery of time itself. Orican is an astromancer, a specialist in reading the stars and predicting the future. But his abilities go far beyond simple prophecy. Orican has developed technologies and techniques that allow him to actually manipulate time, to step outside the normal flow of causality and observe events from a perspective that is nearly omniscient. He has used this ability to great effect, positioning himself and his forces at exactly the right place and time to achieve his goals, often in ways that seem miraculous to observers who don't understand what he's doing. Orican's ultimate goal is even more ambitious than mere prophecy. He believes that by accumulating enough power and knowledge, he can reshape time itself, altering the past to create a more favorable present. He wants to undo the biotransference entirely, to change history so that the Necrontyr never made their deal with the Citan, never became the Necrons, and never had to endure the curse of their mechanical existence. Whether this is actually possible or merely a delusional dream is unclear, but Orican pursues it with single-minded dedication. His rivalry with Trazyn the Infinite is legendary among Necrons. The two have been at odds since before the biotransference, and their conflicts have only intensified during the current era. They fought over access to the tomb of the legendary Necrontyr overlord, Nephrith, for nearly 10,000 years, each trying to gain control of artifacts and knowledge that they believed were stored there. When they finally gained access, they discovered they had both been manipulated by a shard of the Deceiver, one of the Catan, who had used their rivalry to further its own inscrutable goals. The experience forced them to temporarily cooperate, but it did not end their enmity. Orican still seeks revenge on Trazyn for various slights and thefts, and that revenge, when it comes, will likely be spectacular in its scope. Anrakir the Traveller represents yet another facet of Necron society, that of the Wanderer and Awakener. Anrakir has made it his mission to travel across the galaxy, seeking out tomb worlds that still slumber and helping to awaken them. He does this not out of altruism, but out of a deep sense of duty to the Necron species as a whole. He believes that every tomb world that remains dormant is a waste of potential strength, and he will not rest until every Necron who can be awakened has been brought back into the fight. But Anrakir is not content merely to awaken tomb worlds and move on. He often stays to help newly awakened Necrons organize themselves, providing military assistance against immediate threats and offering guidance on how to navigate the changed galaxy. He has assembled a significant following of Necrons from multiple dynasties, warriors who see in his mission something worthy and who have pledged themselves to his cause. This makes Anrakir one of the few truly independent Necron leaders, beholden to no dynasty, but commanding considerable resources and loyalty. Anrakir is also notable for his refusal to accept the authority of the Satan during the ancient past. Where most Necrons eventually fell under the domination of the star gods, Anrakir maintained his independence, and he retains a fierce hatred for any form of slavery or domination. This has made him skeptical of the Silent King's return and the efforts to unify the Necron species under centralized leadership. Anrakir values the freedom that Sarek granted the Necrons when he destroyed the command protocols, and he will not easily accept any new system that might threaten that freedom. Illuminus Xeras represents the darker side of Necron intellectual pursuit. He is a master of biological and mechanical manipulation, a being who views all forms of life as raw materials to be experimented upon and improved. Xeras was one of the key architects of the biotransference process, and he has never stopped trying to perfect his art. He captures specimens from all across the galaxy, organic beings of every description, and subjects them to transformations and augmentations that would horrify most observers. His goal, he claims, is to find a way to reverse the biotransference, to create new organic bodies that could house Necron consciousness. But many suspect that his real motivation is simply the joy of experimentation, the thrill of pushing the boundaries of what is possible, regardless of the ethical implications. Xeras's laboratories are houses of horrors, where the screams of his test subjects echo through halls of living metal. He has created hybrid beings, fusions of organic and mechanical components that should not be able to function, but do, often in disturbing ways. He has attempted to grant consciousness to mindless Necron warriors, with mixed and often tragic results. And he has developed technologies for transferring consciousness between bodies, skills that he uses both for his research and as a service he offers to other Necrons in exchange for resources or favors. The Silent King makes use of Xeras's skills, despite finding the Cryptek's methods distasteful. During the war in the Pariah Nexus, Xeras was given resources and authority to conduct experiments that might advance the Necron's goals, particularly experiments involving human blanks, those rare individuals who possess no presence in the warp, and who might provide insights into how to combat psychically sensitive enemies. But the relationship between Sarek and Xeras is an uneasy one, both recognizing that they need each other, while neither fully trusting the other's ultimate intentions. These individuals, along with dozens of others of nearly equal prominence, shape the character of the Necron threat in the modern galaxy. They are not faceless machines or unthinking automatons. They are beings with distinct personalities, conflicting goals, and the capacity for both brilliance and madness. Understanding them is crucial to understanding how the Necrons might be fought, negotiated with, or manipulated, for they represent both the greatest strengths and the potential weaknesses of the awakening Necron Empire. Challenges of the new galaxy. What awakening revealed? When the Necrons entered their great sleep 60 million years ago, they expected to awaken to a galaxy cleansed of the younger races and ready for conquest. What they have actually found is something far more complex and, in many ways, far more disturbing. The galaxy has not simply moved on without them. It has been fundamentally transformed in ways that make the Necrons' original plans for reconquest far more difficult than anticipated. Understanding these challenges helps explain why the Necrons, despite their overwhelming technological superiority, have not simply swept aside the younger races and reclaimed their empire. The most immediate and visible challenge is demographic. The younger races have multiplied far beyond what the Necrons ever anticipated. When the Necrons went to sleep, the Aeldari were ascendant, but still relatively few in number, occupying only a fraction of the galaxy's habitable worlds. Now, countless species have spread across nearly every corner of the galaxy. Humanity alone controls millions of worlds, with a total population that likely exceeds 1 trillion individuals. The Imperium's military forces, while primitive by Necron standards, are vast enough to present a significant challenge simply through weight of numbers. And humanity is just one of many younger races, each with their own territory and forces. At this demographic reality, creates a practical problem for the Necrons. Their numbers are fixed. Every Necron that was alive at the time of the biotransference is potentially still in existence, but no new Necrons can be created. Every warrior destroyed in battle can potentially be repaired and reanimated, but if a Necron is utterly annihilated, reduced to its component atoms, or cast into a sun, or sucked into a black hole, that Necron is lost forever. The younger races, by contrast, breed and reproduce constantly. They can suffer losses that would be catastrophic for the Necrons, and simply replenish their numbers within a generation or two. This means that the Necrons cannot afford to fight wars of attrition. They must win decisively and efficiently, or risk being overwhelmed by sheer numbers. And the territorial challenge is equally significant. Many tomb worlds have awakened to find that the younger races have built entire civilizations directly on top of Necron burial grounds. Imperial hive cities sit atop tomb complexes, their foundations extending down into chambers that once held sleeping Necrons. Orc settlements sprawl across what were once the gardens and monuments of Necron nobility. Eldari maiden worlds have been established on planets that the Necrons claim as their rightful territory. Tau colonies have expanded into sectors that were part of ancient Necron holdings. In some cases, the younger races are completely unaware of what lies beneath them, but in others, they have discovered Necron artifacts and technology, sometimes trying to understand or replicate it, or other times simply destroying what they find out of fear or ignorance. For the Necrons, this is not merely an inconvenience, it is an insult. These younger races are, from the Necron perspective, barely evolved primitives who have been squatting in spaces they have no right to occupy. The Necron response to this situation varies by dynasty and individual. Some, like the Nihilak, launch campaigns of extermination, seeking to cleanse their former territories of all younger race presence, regardless of the strategic value of doing so. Others take a more pragmatic approach, focusing on reclaiming key systems while tolerating younger race presence in less strategically important areas, at least for the time being. But reclaiming territory is complicated by the fact that many tomb worlds themselves have been damaged or destroyed during the long sleep. Tectonic activity has crushed tomb complexes that were not buried deep enough. Volcanic eruptions have flooded chambers with magma. Impacts from asteroids or comets have breached tomb walls, exposing the sleeping Necrons to hostile environments. In some tragic cases, younger races have discovered and entered tomb complexes, sometimes inadvertently destroying priceless artifacts and irreplaceable Necrons while exploring what they thought were merely ancient ruins. The technological landscape of the galaxy has also changed in ways that surprise and sometimes concern the Necrons. While no younger race has achieved technological parity with the Necrons, as some have developed capabilities that the Necrons did not anticipate. The Imperium's Psykers, for example, can manipulate the warp in ways that Necron technology struggles to counter. The Necrons, having no connection to the warp themselves, find psychic abilities particularly difficult to defend against. They have developed technologies like the null field matrix that can disrupt psychic powers, but these are energy-intensive and not always effective against the most powerful Psykers. The Tau Empire, despite being one of the youngest spacefaring civilizations, has demonstrated a capacity for rapid technological advancement that has earned grudging respect from some Necrons. While their weapons are still far inferior to Necron equivalents, their rate of improvement is concerning. If given enough time, the Tau might actually develop technologies that could pose a serious threat to Necron forces. This has led some Necron strategists to argue that the Tau should be wiped out preemptively before they can develop into a more significant threat. The Eldari, despite their diminished state, remain one of the most dangerous opponents the Necrons face. The Eldari have long memories. They remember the war in heaven and the role the Necrons played in nearly destroying their species. They possess technologies, particularly related to the webway and psychic manipulation, that can sometimes counter Necron advantages. Eldari seers can sometimes predict Necron movements, allowing their forces to ambush or avoid Necron armies. Aeldari Harlequins, with their mastery of the webway, can strike at Necron holdings and withdraw before the Necrons can respond. And the Eldari have shown a willingness to take desperate actions to prevent Necrons from achieving their goals, even if doing so costs them dearly. Perhaps the most unexpected and disturbing discovery for many awakened Necrons is the state of the warp itself. During the war in Heaven, the warp was turbulent, but still fundamentally a tool that could be used and manipulated by those with the knowledge. Now, the warp has become actively hostile, a realm of chaos and madness dominated by entities of pure malevolence. The four chaos gods, Khorne, Tzeentch, Nurgle, and Slaanesh, have shaped the warp into a hell dimension that threatens to spill over into reality at any moment. The Great Rift, that massive tear in reality that now bisects the galaxy, there represents a wound in the fabric of space itself, and it is growing. For the Necrons, who view the warp with a mixture of contempt and unease, this development is deeply troubling. They cannot directly fight warp entities with their technology, or at least not easily. Demons that can be killed in the material universe simply return to the warp to eventually re-manifest. Chaos corruption can affect even Necron technology under certain circumstances, warping it in ways that make it unpredictable or dangerous. The Necrons' only real defense against the warp is to deny it access to reality, to use technologies like their pylons and null field matrices to strengthen the barriers between dimensions. But these technologies are energy intensive and cannot be deployed everywhere. Internal challenges among the Necrons themselves also complicate their efforts at reconquest. The Destroyer cult continues to grow, with more Necrons falling victim to the nihilistic philosophy that all organic life should be eradicated. While useful in battle, Destroyers are also unstable and difficult to control. They will sometimes ignore orders if they see an opportunity to kill organic beings, and their presence can demoralize other Necron forces who see in the Destroyers a potential fate that awaits them all. The Flayer virus remains incurable and continues to claim victims. Entire tomb worlds have been quarantined because the virus spread among the population, transforming them into flayed ones. These afflicted Necrons are shunned and feared, but they are also sometimes used as shock troops, released upon enemy positions to sow terror and confusion. The flayed ones themselves seem to exist in a state of perpetual torment, driven by urges they cannot fully understand or satisfy, reaching for a humanity they can never reclaim. The greatest internal challenge, however, remains the fractured nature of Necron society itself. Without unified command, the dynasties pursue conflicting goals. Resources are wasted on internal conflicts when they could be used against external threats. Opportunities for strategic cooperation are missed because of ancient rivalries or personality conflicts between different overlords. The Silent King's efforts to create unity have had some success, but they have also created resistance among those Necrons who fear a return to the absolute authority that once defined their society. On the galaxy the Necrons have awakened to is not the galaxy they expected. It is more crowded, more dangerous, and more complex. But it is also, in its own way, more interesting. The younger races have created civilizations and accomplished feats that the Necrons find difficult to completely dismiss as primitive savagery. There are Necrons who have begun to wonder if perhaps these younger races have something to teach them, if perhaps the galaxy has moved forward in ways that the Necrons, frozen in their eternal mechanical existence, have not. These thoughts are dangerous, borderline heretical by Necron standards, but they persist nonetheless, adding yet another layer of complexity to the already challenging task of navigating this new reality. Conflicts across the stars, when ancients meet the young. The awakening of the Necrons has brought them into conflict with virtually every other faction in the galaxy. These conflicts range from small skirmishes over individual worlds to massive campaigns that span entire sectors. Each conflict reveals something about both the Necrons and their opponents. shaping strategies and creating precedents that will influence the future of the galaxy. Understanding these major conflicts helps illuminate the nature of the Necron threat and the ways in which the younger races have attempted to respond. The conflicts between Necrons and the Imperium of Man are perhaps the most numerous, if only because the Imperium controls such a vast territory that overlap with Necron holdings is inevitable. The Imperium's response to the Necron threat has evolved over time, from initial confusion and misclassification to growing understanding and the development of specific anti-Necron tactics. The Imperium has learned, often at great cost, that conventional warfare against Necrons requires overwhelming force and specific strategies to be effective. The Orphean War, fought in the Orphean sector, exemplifies the kind of large-scale conflict that has become increasingly common. The Maynarch dynasty, awakening to find their territory occupied by Imperial forces, launched a campaign to reclaim it. What made the Maynarch particularly dangerous was the high proportion of their population that had been afflicted with mental degradation during the long sleep. They fought with a brutality and disregard for their own preservation that exceeded even typical Necron ruthlessness. Imperial forces initially attempted to hold their ground using conventional defensive strategies, but they quickly discovered that such approaches were ineffective against an enemy that could not be truly killed and that cared nothing for casualties. The turning point in the Orphean War came when the Imperium deployed specialized forces, including Space Marine chapters trained in fighting Xenos threats and elements of the Astra Militarum, equipped with heavy weapons designed to completely destroy enemy bodies rather than simply disable them. The strategy became not to defeat the Necrons in battle, which was often impossible, but to delay them long enough to evacuate Imperial populations and scorched earth tactics that rendered the reclaimed worlds useless to the Necrons. It was a bitter victory, with entire worlds lost, but it demonstrated that the Necrons could be fought successfully if one was willing to accept massive casualties and strategic sacrifices. The Shield of Bel campaign presented a different dynamic, one where Necrons, Space Marines, and Tyranids all converged on the same region of space. The Blood Angels chapter, defending their home territories from a Tyranid invasion, found themselves facing not just one existential threat, but two, when Necron forces also entered the conflict. The situation was complicated by the fact that the Necrons, led by elements of forces aligned with the Silent King, viewed the Tyranids as the primary threat and were willing to temporarily put aside their enmity with the Space Marines to fight the common foe. The alliance that formed during the Battle of Gehenna, part of the larger Shield of Bel campaign, was tense and temporary. Both sides knew they would likely turn on each other once the Tyranid threat was dealt with, but the immediate danger was too great to ignore. The Necrons provided superior firepower and tactical coordination, while the Blood Angels brought their unmatched skill in close combat and their willingness to sacrifice themselves for victory. The combined force was able to drive back the Tyranid incursion, though both sides suffered significant casualties. When the battle was won, both forces withdrew, neither wanting to test the fragile alliance further. The event demonstrated that cooperation between Necrons and the younger races was possible, but only in the most extreme circumstances and only temporarily. The conflicts between Necrons and Eldari are particularly bitter, carrying the weight of millions of years of history. The Eldari remember the war in heaven and the role the Necrons played in nearly destroying their species. They view the Necron awakening as an apocalyptic threat, one that could finally complete what was started so long ago. Eldari seers have foreseen multiple potential futures where awakened Necrons sweep across the galaxy, destroying or enslaving all who stand in their way. This has led to a policy of preemptive strikes, with Eldari forces attacking tomb worlds that are in the early stages of awakening, trying to destroy the Necrons before they can fully mobilize their forces. These preemptive strikes have had mixed success. In some cases, Eldari forces have successfully destroyed tomb complexes that were vulnerable during the awakening process. In others, they have simply awakened tomb worlds that might have remained dormant for centuries longer, inadvertently strengthening the Necron threat. The Aeldari lack the numbers to fight a prolonged war against fully awakened tomb worlds, so their strategy relies on surgical strikes and careful timing. But this approach requires perfect intelligence and flawless execution, and mistakes have been costly. One notable Aeldari success came at the tomb world of Serenon, where an Aeldari strike force, led by the Autarch Kylith, managed to infiltrate the tomb complex during its awakening and sabotage its primary power systems. The resulting cascade failure destroyed a significant portion of the tomb's population before they could be fully revived. But the Necrons of Serenon survived the attack and eventually recovered, and they now hunt Aeldari forces with particular ferocity, seeking revenge for the losses inflicted upon them. The Orcish hordes present a different kind of challenge for the Necrons. Unlike the Imperium or the Aeldari, Orcs do not strategize in any conventional sense. They attack because fighting is in their nature, and they pursue Necron tomb worlds not out of any calculated plan, but simply because the Necrons represent good opponents to fight. As this makes Orcs particularly frustrating enemies for Necron commanders who rely on predicting enemy behavior. Orcish forces will do things that make no tactical sense, launching suicidal assaults that should fail but sometimes succeed through sheer bloody-minded determination. They will ignore obvious strategic targets to attack positions that offer better fights. And their tendency to emit psychic fields that can actually alter reality through collective belief means that Orcish weapons sometimes damage Necrons in ways that should be impossible. There have been cases where massive Orcish invasions have overrun Necron tomb worlds through sheer weight of numbers and ferocity. The tomb world of Grindelor fell to an Orcish horde, led by a particularly large and aggressive warlord. The Necrons fought with their typical efficiency, destroying thousands of Orcs for every Necron lost. But the Orcs kept coming in seemingly endless waves. Eventually, the tomb's energy reserves were depleted, its repair facilities overwhelmed, and key systems damaged beyond immediate repair. The surviving Necrons were forced to phase out and withdraw to other tomb worlds, leaving Grindelor in Orcish hands, at least temporarily. The Tyranids represent perhaps the most existential threat to Necron plans for the future. As living beings with no souls and minimal psychic presence, Tyranids are difficult for Necrons to detect until they are already attacking. Their adaptation abilities mean that strategies that work once may be ineffective in subsequent encounters as the hive mind learns and evolves. Most troublingly for the Necrons, for every battle against Tyranids carries the risk that the Tyranids will consume vast amounts of biomass, making it that much less likely that the Necrons will ever be able to reverse the biotransference. The Silent King's campaign against the Tyranids has become the central organizing principle for a significant portion of Necron military activity. Necron forces have engaged Tyranid splinter fleets across multiple sectors, attempting to destroy them before they can join with the main hive fleets. The Necrons have advantages in this fight. Their lack of biomass means that Tyranids gain nothing from consuming Necron bodies, and Necron weapons are highly effective against Tyranid creatures. But the sheer numbers of the Tyranids and their ability to adapt to Necron tactics mean that every victory is temporary and hard-won. One of the most significant Necron anti-Tyranid operations occurred when a tomb world identified an approaching Tyranid hive ship while it was still in deep space. Rather than wait for it to reach a habitable world, Necron forces intercepted the hive ship and destroyed it, using weapons capable of destabilizing its biological functions at the molecular level. The operation was a success, eliminating a Tyranid threat before it could reach populated space, but it also demonstrated the resources required for such operations. The Necrons cannot possibly intercept every Tyranid ship in deep space. There are simply too many. They can only target the most dangerous threats and hope that the younger races can handle the rest. And conflicts with the forces of chaos present unique challenges, because chaos entities operate according to rules that Necrons find difficult to understand or counter. Demons that are destroyed simply return to the warp to regenerate. Chaos corruption can affect Necron technology in unpredictable ways. Chaos champions empowered by the dark gods can perform feats that seem to violate the fundamental laws of physics. For the Necrons, who view the warp as an abomination that should not exist, fighting chaos forces is particularly frustrating because their usual advantages in technology and tactical thinking are diminished against enemies that can break the rules of reality itself. The Necron response to chaos has been to develop and deploy technologies specifically designed to counteract warp influence. The pylon networks that some tomb worlds possess can strengthen the barriers between reality and the warp, making it more difficult for demons to manifest. Null field matrices can disrupt the connection between chaos sorcerers and the entities they attempt to summon. But these technologies are energy intensive and cannot be deployed everywhere. The Necrons have been forced to adopt a strategy of containment rather than elimination, focusing on preventing chaos from spreading into Necron territories, while accepting that they cannot completely eliminate the chaos threat. One of the most alarming chaos-related incidents occurred when the Necron tomb world of Oltep awakened to find that a demon prince of Khorne had taken up residence in the hollowed-out core of their planet, the daemon, Boibelgor, and had slaughtered the human population that had been living on the surface and had used their blood to create a permanent breach between reality and the warp. When the Necrons awakened and attempted to reclaim their world, they found themselves fighting not in the material universe, but in a realm where the warp and reality overlapped. The entire Necron population of Oltep was destroyed in the attempt to reclaim their world, unable to effectively fight in an environment where their weapons and tactics were far less effective. These conflicts, and hundreds of others like them across the galaxy, have shaped how the Necrons approach warfare in the modern era. They have learned that they cannot simply rely on technological superiority to guarantee victory. They must adapt their strategies to account for the specific characteristics of different enemies. They must accept that some battles cannot be won and that strategic withdrawals are sometimes necessary. And they must begin to consider the possibility that cooperation with the younger races, distasteful as it might be, may sometimes be necessary for the survival of both the Necrons and those they once planned to conquer. The future of the Necrons. What lies ahead? As the 42nd millennium begins, the Necrons stand at a crossroads. They are more unified than they have been since before the Great Sleep, yet still divided by ancient rivalries and conflicting philosophies. They are more numerous and powerful than at any time since their awakening, yet still far from the heights they reached before they slumbered. The decisions made by Necron leaders in the coming centuries will determine not only the fate of the Necrons themselves, but potentially the fate of the entire galaxy. The Silent King's vision for the Necron future centers on two interconnected goals: defeating the Tyranid threat and reversing the biotransference. These goals are, in Sarek's view, inseparable. The Tyranids must be defeated, or at least contained, to preserve the biomass necessary for any attempt to restore the Necrons to organic form, and the biotransference must be reversed to give the Necrons a future worth fighting for, to restore to them what was taken away so many millions of years ago. But both of these goals face significant obstacles. The campaign against the Tyranids is showing some successes, but it is far from certain that the Necrons can achieve decisive victory. The Tyranids are too numerous, too adaptable, and too relentless. Every splinter fleet that is destroyed seems to be replaced by two more emerging from the intergalactic void. The Silent King's strategy of working through proxies and manipulating younger races to fight the Tyranids on his behalf has had limited effectiveness. The younger races are too focused on their own conflicts to fully appreciate the magnitude of the Tyranid threat, and they resist Necron manipulation even when it would be in their own interest to cooperate. The question of reversing the biotransference is even more complex and uncertain. Illumina Ceras and other cryptechs have been conducting experiments for millions of years, attempting to find a way to restore Necron consciousness to organic form. They have had some limited successes in understanding the mechanics of consciousness transfer, but the fundamental problem remains unsolved. The souls of the Necrontyr were consumed by the Citan during the original biotransference. They are gone, irretrievably lost. No amount of technological sophistication can restore what no longer exists. The best the Necrons might hope for is to transfer their consciousnesses into organic bodies, but these would be new bodies, cloned or grown, or perhaps taken from other species. They would not be a restoration of what was lost, but a new form of existence that might be even more problematic than the current mechanical one. Some Necrons, led philosophically, if not always explicitly by Imhotep the Stormlord, reject the entire premise of reversing the biotransference. They argue that the Necrons' mechanical forms are not a curse, but an evolution, that they should embrace what they have become rather than clinging to nostalgia for a past that can never be reclaimed. These Necrons view the campaign against the Tyranids as worthwhile, as any threat to the galaxy is a threat to the Necrons, but they see the obsession with returning to flesh as a waste of resources and effort. This philosophical divide threatens to split Necron society even more deeply than dynastic rivalries, because it goes to the fundamental question of what it means to be a Necron and what the Necrons are ultimately fighting for. The opening of the Great Rift has added another layer of complexity to the Necron situation. Or the massive tear in reality that now bisects the galaxy has created new challenges and new opportunities. Warp storms make travel difficult or impossible in some regions, isolating tomb worlds from each other and from the rest of the galaxy. Chaos incursions are more frequent and more powerful as the barriers between the warp and reality have been weakened. But the Great Rift has also disrupted the younger races, dividing the Imperium in half and creating chaos that the Necrons can potentially exploit. Some Necron cryptechs believe that the pylon technology the Necrons possess could be used to actually seal the Great Rift, or at least stabilize it and prevent it from growing larger. This technology was originally developed during the War in Heaven to combat the psychic powers of the Old Ones and their servant races. At its peak, and it could create fields that completely blocked access to the warp, making it impossible for psychic powers to function within them. If this technology could be deployed on a large enough scale, it might be possible to heal the wound in reality that the Great Rift represents. The Silent King has shown interest in this possibility, seeing it as a way to gain leverage over the younger races. If the Necrons could credibly threaten to seal the rift, or conversely could offer to do so in exchange for concessions, it would give them enormous negotiating power. The Imperium, in particular, is desperate for any solution to the rift, as it has divided their empire and cut off entire sectors from the light of the Astronomicon. But deploying pylon technology on the scale necessary would require resources and coordination that the Necrons currently lack. It would require the cooperation of multiple dynasties and the awakening of tomb worlds that possess the necessary technological infrastructure. And it would require time that the Necrons may not have as other threats continue to mount. The Pariah Nexus, a region of space where the Necrons have deployed massive arrays of pylons to create a null zone that suppresses all psychic activity, represents a test case for this technology. The Imperium views the Pariah Nexus as a threat, a region where their psychic communications and navigation are impossible, and where their psykers are reduced to helpless baseline humans. They have launched military campaigns to destroy the Nexus, leading to some of the most intense fighting in recent years. The Necrons, led by forces aligned with the Silent King, have defended the Nexus with everything they have, seeing it as crucial to their long-term strategy of combating chaos and potentially sealing the Great Rift. The outcome of the fighting around the Pariah Nexus remains uncertain. The Imperium has committed significant forces, including elements of multiple Space Marine chapters and entire battle groups of the Imperial Navy. The Necrons have countered with some of their most advanced technologies and their most skilled commanders. The battles have been characterized by high casualties on both sides and by the use of weapons and tactics that push the boundaries of what is considered acceptable even in the brutal warfare of the 41st millennium. And the strategic importance of the Nexus means that neither side can afford to lose. but both are paying a terrible price to maintain their positions. Looking further into the future, there are several possible paths the Necron awakening could take. In the most optimistic scenario from the Necron perspective, more tomb worlds continue to awaken. The fractious dynasties gradually coalesce under the Silent King's leadership or some other unifying force, and the Necrons establish themselves as the dominant military power in the galaxy. They push back the Tyranid threat, contain or eliminate the Chaos incursions, and subjugate or exterminate the younger races. This would represent the fulfillment of the Silent King's plan from millions of years ago. Though whether the Necrons would then turn their attention to reversing the biotransference or simply accept their mechanical existence would remain an open question. A more pessimistic scenario sees the Necrons remaining divided, unable to overcome their internal conflicts and ancient rivalries. Tomb worlds continue to awaken, but instead of working together, they fight each other for resources and territory. The younger races, recognizing the threat the Necrons pose, begin to cooperate more effectively against them. The Tyranids continue to advance, consuming more and more biomass and making the goal of reversing biotransference increasingly impossible. In this scenario, the Necrons become just one more faction in the endless wars that consume the galaxy, powerful but unable to achieve their ultimate goals, i.e. trapped in a cycle of conflict that has no resolution. A third possibility, perhaps the most interesting, is that the Necrons begin to evolve and change in ways that neither the Silent King nor anyone else anticipated. Some Necrons might find new purposes beyond reconquest or restoration, might develop interests and goals that were impossible in their organic forms. Trazian's obsession with preservation and collection might spread to other Necrons, creating a civilization dedicated to understanding and recording rather than conquering and destroying. The Nephrek's vision of transcending even their mechanical forms might prove achievable, leading to Necrons who exist as beings of pure energy, neither organic nor mechanical, but something entirely new. These possibilities remain speculative, but they represent potential futures that could fundamentally transform what it means to be a Necron. What is certain is that the Necrons are not going away. Every year, more tomb worlds awaken. Every decade, the Necrons grow stronger and more organized. The younger races have had 60 million years to spread across the galaxy, to build their civilizations and their empires. Now, the previous rulers of the galaxy are returning, and they intend to reclaim what they view as their rightful inheritance. The age of the Necrons is not something that happened in the distant past. It is something that is happening right now, slowly and inexorably, as ancient machines stir from their long sleep and remember what they once were, what they lost, and what they intend to reclaim. Conclusion. The awakening of the Necrons represents one of the most significant developments in the history of Warhammer 40,000's galaxy. It is not simply the return of another Xenos threat, one more enemy for the Imperium and others to fight. It is the return of a species that once dominated the galaxy, that possesses technology far beyond what any current civilization can match, and that has both the patience and the ruthlessness to pursue goals that span millennia. The Necrons are not in a hurry. They have already waited 60 million years. They can wait another 1,000 or 10,000 years if that is what it takes to achieve their objectives. This patience, combined with their near immortality and their technological superiority, makes them uniquely dangerous. But the Necrons are also, in their own way, tragic figures. They are the victims of their own hubris, having sought immortality and received instead an eternal existence that is barely recognizable as life. They are prisoners in metal shells, shadows of what they once were, clinging to goals and purposes that may no longer be achievable. Some of them retain enough consciousness to understand what has been lost. And for these individuals, their awakening is not a triumph, but a return to an existence that offers no real joy or satisfaction, only endless purpose without meaning. The galaxy has changed while the Necrons slept. New civilizations have risen, new technologies have been developed and new threats have emerged. The Necrons must navigate this changed reality, adapting strategies developed millions of years ago to situations their ancient planners could never have anticipated. What they must decide whether to remain isolated within their dynasties or to unite under common leadership. They must choose between accepting what they have become or continuing to pursue the impossible dream of restoration. And they must do all this while fighting wars on multiple fronts against enemies, ranging from the mindless hunger of the Tyranids to the reality-warping power of chaos. The younger races, who now populate the galaxy, face a choice as well. They can view the Necrons solely as enemies to be fought and destroyed, or they can recognize that in some circumstances, temporary cooperation might benefit all parties. The precedent set at Gehenna and other conflicts suggests that such cooperation is possible, but the deep-seated mutual animosity between Necrons and the younger races makes it difficult and unstable. Their trust is nearly impossible when one side views the other as barely sentient primitives, and the other sees only soulless killing machines. As you explore the Warhammer 40,000 universe, as you play games or read novels or simply imagine the vast scope of this galaxy in the grim darkness of the far future, remember the Necrons. Remember that beneath countless worlds, in tombs you cannot see and defenses you cannot imagine, ancient beings are stirring. Their patience is infinite, their power is terrible, and their purpose is absolute. The awakening is not complete, but it is underway, and with each passing year, more of these ancient warriors return to reclaim a galaxy that has forgotten them. The younger races celebrate their achievements and their civilizations, but they do so on borrowed time, living in spaces that the Necrons still consider their own, building their futures on foundations that predate their existence by millions of years. The Necrons are awakening, and the galaxy will never be the same. Whether this represents the beginning of a new Necron empire or simply another chapter in the endless wars that define the Warhammer 40,000 universe remains to be seen. What is certain is that the story of the Necrons is far from over. It is, in many ways, just beginning. And as more tomb worlds come online, as more ancient warriors rise from their long sleep, the impact of the Necron awakening will be felt in every corner of the galaxy. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into the lore of the Necrons and their awakening, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps me create more content, exploring the rich universe of Warhammer 40,000. Drop a comment below sharing your thoughts on the Necrons, your favorite dynasty, or which aspect of Necron lore you'd like to see explored in future videos. Thank you for watching, and remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, and the ancient dead are walking once again.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any, and yeah, sleep well.